canyon walls pressed in like stone jaws, their edges glowing faint under a desert moon. Task Unit Viper had been moving on foot for hours when the first burst of enemy fire cracked across the rocks. The unit was small, drawn from Navy Special Operations, trained for hostile terrain. But no training could erase the feeling of being funneled into a kill zone. The ambush came sharp and disciplined. Mortar rounds punched dust into the air. Rifle fire rattled from 3 sides. The canyon became a box with no clear exit. Lieutenant Commander Nolan Beck steadied his breathing, pressing his shoulder against the wall of stone. His men needed a leader who did not flinch, and he would not give them reason to doubt. The radio sputtered, then died with static, cutting them off from higher command. Close air support was over an hour away, and they had no reinforcements. Each magazine counted like gold, and most carried only 1 or 2 left. The enemy knew it, and kept pressing. Beck glanced over his team, weighing their faces against the math of survival. Chief Petty Officer Tessa Quinn kept her designated marksman rifle tight in her shoulder, but the swirling wind twisted every shot. Bullets bent wide, the canyon funneling air currents into unpredictable gusts. She whispered a curse and reset her sights. But her breathing stayed calm. The discipline drilled into her bones. Petty Officer Min Lee called out low that he had 2 magazines left, maybe 60 rounds. Jacob Price crouched near him, sweat cutting trails through the dust on his face as he armed a claymore, setting the wires at an angle to cover their flank. Special Warfare Combat Medic Eli Navarro was bent over Chief Raul Vega, a tourniquet cinched high on the thigh where blood seeped through shredded fabric. Navarro's gloves were slick with it, but his hands stayed steady. He pressed down hard, locked the strap, then gave Vega's shoulder a squeeze before snapping his rifle back into the fight. The battlefield did not allow breaks, only seconds stolen between incoming fire. Vega groaned but tried to raise his weapon anyway. His jaw clenched against the pain. Beck caught his eye and shook his head once. An order without words. The canyon howled with every gust, the wind turning muzzle flashes into scattered sparks. Enemy fighters shouted from the ridges, their voices echoing off the rock, bouncing in patterns meant to confuse. Beck tracked the sound, picked out the rhythm, and realized they were trying to herd his team deeper into the choke point. He raised his hand, signaling a slow crawl to the left shelf, giving them more cover. His movements were measured, no wasted motion. The kind that gave men confidence, even when everything else screamed panic. Rounds punched the dirt inches from his boots. A burst of machine gun fire tore into the canyon wall, flinging chips of stone that sliced his cheek. Beck ignored the sting. He slapped a fresh magazine into his M4, racked the charging handle, and leaned back against cover. The weight of his role pressed hard, but he wore it with quiet defiance. In that moment, the canyon felt like it was breathing against them, each second narrowing the circle. They were cut off, low on ammunition, and burdened with a wounded man. Yet no one spoke of surrender. Each action was sharp, controlled, forged in training that demanded they fight until the last round. The night deepened, shadows crawling across the canyon floor as the gunfire echoed. Task Unit Viper was trapped, but their discipline held the line. Beck knew the margin was razor thin. One more push, and the enemy would close the net. His chest tightened with the thought, but his voice stayed even when he spoke. They would hold as long as they had breath, because that was what their oath demanded. Survival now came down to grit, precision, and the thin hope that something unseen might break the storm pressing in. The canyon shook under the next burst of machine gun fire, a PKM hammering from the ridge and chewing scars into the rock face above Viper's heads. Chips of stone sprayed across helmets and goggles, a few fragments cutting into skin. The sound drowned out everything else for a moment. Then, from somewhere far beyond the chaos, came a single sharp crack. It cut clean through the noise. The PKM sputtered to silence, its gunner dropping sideways out of view. The sudden hush felt impossible, like the desert itself had drawn in a breath. Beck froze, His cheek pressed against the dirt. His mind tried to calculate what he had just heard. The shot had come from well over a mile, maybe farther, yet it landed with perfect precision. Before anyone could speak, another crack rolled down the canyon, then another. Each shot fell exact, each target silenced without wasted rounds. The ridge that had been alive with muzzle flashes turned quiet. The enemy faltered, their advance stalling as if an unseen hand had cut them down mid-stride. The radio hissed with static, then steadied. A voice came through, low and calm, carrying the grit of years in the field. Viper. This is Watchman 7. Stay down. I'll clear the lanes. Beck blinked hard. The call sign was one he had heard only in whispers. A name buried in training lore. No one admitted it was real. Watchman 7 was supposed to be a myth, an old ghost from conflicts that had never made it into official reports. Yet here, that voice was steady in his headset, commanding the chaos with ease. Quinn lifted her scope and scanned the far ridges. For a moment the heat shimmer blurred everything. Then her glass caught a faint silhouette. A figure lay prone against the stone, rifle braced steady on a bipod. The barrel barely moved. Beside him sat a small chalkboard, numbers scrawled in neat rows. Temperature, barometric pressure, wind drift, density altitude, each note marked for correction, each detail written with a hand that trusted no electronics. He shifted his hold, adjusted a single click, then fired again. The round traveled more than 1,500 meters and dropped another target. Beck felt a chill rise through his chest. Whoever this was, he was not only skilled, he was patient. His rhythm was deliberate. 5 rounds in less than half a minute, each landing exactly where it had to. Through the radio, his tone never wavered. Shift 2 south. Plug 7 o'clock. Move now. The instructions were crisp, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world while lives hung on every second. Beck gave the hand signal, and his team crawled toward the southern shelf, boots scraping rock as fire from the opposite flank picked up again. The sniper answered with another series of shots. 1, 2, 3. Each round erased a muzzle flash, each hit collapsing an enemy firing nest before it could pin Viper down. The militants shouted in broken Russian, confusion spilling through their lines. Some froze. Others pulled back, unsure what was cutting their strength apart. For the first time in hours, silence spread across pieces of the canyon. Beck pressed his back to the stone, his pulse hammering in his ears, realizing someone had just shifted the entire balance of the fight. Then the voice returned, quieter this time, almost personal. Beck, just like Detroit, 1990. Don't repeat your father's mistake. The canyon seemed to fall away with those words. Beck's breath caught. His father's name had not been spoken over open comms for decades. His father had vanished on a mission in Detroit, his record buried under the label of failure. Now, in the middle of this canyon, a stranger who shot like no one else had reached across time and pulled that ghost back into the open. Beck swallowed hard, the weight of it pressing deeper than the gunfire. His men looked at him, waiting for direction, but he could not explain what he had just heard. The myth was real, and it knew his family. Watchman 7 was not only saving them, he was tying this night to a past Beck had spent his whole career trying to outrun. The canyon was still dangerous, the enemy regrouping on the flanks, but something inside Viper shifted. The fear had not left, but it was tempered by awe. They were not alone anymore. A ghost had stepped out of legend, and with every precise shot he fired, hope took root in the dirt beside them. The night after the ambush was colder than the desert should have been, the wind crawling over stone like a warning that refused to fade. Beck followed a narrow trail toward a ridgeline, the path leading to a ranger station long abandoned. Its windows were shattered, the wooden porch sagging. But the place offered a wide view of every approach. It was the kind of ground chosen by someone who thought in firing arcs, not comfort. His boots crunched gravel as he neared the porch, rifle low, palms open, the posture of a man who expected trouble. A figure stepped from the shadows, shoulders square, movement calm. A hand signal flicked across his chest, 2 fingers and a cut downward, old recognition drills used before digital codes. Beck answered without hesitation, returning the signal. Silence lingered. Then the man spoke, his voice carrying the same gravel Beck had heard on the radio. It was Master Chief Petty Officer Colton Shaw. He looked older than the stories had painted him, his face lined deep. But the way he held himself had not changed. His presence alone carried the weight of decades in uniform. Beck's throat tightened. Shaw had been believed dead for years, a casualty written off and buried under rumor. Yet here he stood, rifle slung with the casual balance of someone who never stopped training. From the doorway, 4 more men appeared, each moving with the subtle precision of veterans who had not lost their edge. There was Frank Dalton, his frame broad enough to fill the doorway. Riley Cross, eyes sharp, rifle angled but not lowered. Michael Trent, a medic whose calm steadiness never left him. And Owen Pierce, glasses glinting, posture as rigid as if he still worked in intelligence. The silence grew heavier. No one saluted. No ceremony. These were men who had stepped outside the system long ago. Shaw finally broke it. The words plain. Sentinel Accord. Not official. Not acknowledged. When the system fails, we don't. His tone carried no pride. Only fact. Beck nodded once. A gesture of understanding. But Cross leveled his weapon at Beck's chest. His voice was edged with suspicion. Talk is cheap. Who are you really serving? The air felt charged. The weight of trust balanced on a knife edge. Beck kept his hand steady. He spoke the phrase his father had whispered before his final mission. Detroit, 1990. Check the south stairs twice. The words hung in the air like a key fitting a lock. Cross's eyes flicked to Shaw, and the older man gave a faint nod. The rifle lowered. The room exhaled. Beck was in. It was not acceptance, but it was the first step toward it. Brotherhood was measured here in codes and scars, not in paperwork or rank. Inside the station, maps were spread across the table, grease pencil lines cutting across terrain like scars of memory. Shaw pointed to a series of nodes marked with careful annotations. Project Meridian, he explained in few words. A Cold War network buried inside civilian infrastructure. Microwave relays, survey stations, fiber splices. Official cover listed them as environmental monitoring. But in truth, they moved intelligence off book, far from oversight. The network was never dismantled, only updated. It had been waiting for decades, feeding those who controlled it. Beck listened, his pulse heavy in his chest. The name had been buried in his father's notes. Aaron Beck had chased those threads until he vanished in Detroit, his mission swallowed by the same network. Now Shaw laid it bare. Meridian had never died. It was alive, woven into the country's veins. And tonight, it had nearly killed Beck's team in the canyon. The thought pressed hard. A betrayal so large it felt like the ground had shifted under him. Shaw's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. You understand now. Beck gave a single nod. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about truth that had been buried for 30 years. Sentinel Accord had stayed in the shadows to hold a line when the system failed. Now, Beck was part of that burden, carrying the weight of a legacy that refused to die. The room felt heavier, but within that weight there was something else, a spark of resolve. The facility sat quiet under the desert night, its glass walls dimmed and a thin fence stretching around the perimeter. It looked modern, but carried the sloppiness of private security. Cameras mounted high but wired through old analog feeds. Quinn crouched by the junction box, her hands working fast. She clipped a wire, inserted a bypass, and watched a small light shift from red to green. 6 minutes. That was all they had before the loop broke and the system caught up. Beck gave a nod, his hand signal sending the team forward. They moved low, rifles angled down, boots finding silent ground. Beck reached the first corridor, where 2 guards loitered near an elevator. Their posture was lazy, weapons slung without discipline. Beck closed the distance in seconds, striking one in the throat with his forearm and jamming a nerve cluster under the other's jaw with the edge of his palm. Both collapsed without a sound. Navarro dragged the bodies out of view while Dalton set a wedge against the door. No words were spoken. Their discipline was the language. The team advanced deeper, clearing each hallway with sharp corners and controlled arcs. Quinn checked her watch, whispering the countdown in clipped tones. 4 minutes left. They slipped into a private wing where the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. A single bed sat under a low light. On it lay Viktor Milenov, his shoulder bandaged, his face pale but his eyes sharp. He recognized Shaw first, his lips curling into a thin smile that carried both scorn and familiarity. Beck stepped closer, his rifle steady, but Shaw lifted a hand, signaling restraint. Milenov coughed, his voice rough. "You think Rusk is your enemy. He is not the master. He is only a courier." The words fell like a weight, pulling the air from the room. Beck felt the tension rise, every second reminding them that their window was closing. The truth was closer, but so was discovery. 3 minutes left. The mission had just shifted from a breach to a reckoning. Milenov's smile thinned as he leaned forward on the bed, his voice rasping like gravel. "You chased the wrong man. Rusk is nothing. The one who owns the board is General Everett Lyle, Director of National Intelligence." The name froze Beck in place. The words carried more weight than the gunfire outside the canyon ever had. If true, the corruption stretched to the highest tier of command. Before Beck could press for more, a sharp alarm split the silence. Red lights pulsed across the ceiling, the security loop collapsing ahead of schedule. Quinn cursed under her breath, already pulling wires from her kit. Dalton snapped the safety off his weapon. Posting at the door, Shaw gave the signal, his voice low but firm. "We move. Now." Boots hit the floor in practiced rhythm, rifles up, each man sliding into the disciplined flow of retreat. The facility came alive with shouting and pounding footsteps. Beck fired short, controlled bursts down the hall, each round meant to suppress rather than waste. Navarro kept a steady hand on Milenov's arm, dragging him toward the exit despite his limp. Cross and Dalton alternated, cover fire, sweeping arcs to hold the flanks. Pierce's voice came over comms, calling out hostile movement with the clipped tone of an analyst who had seen this before. The night opened wide as they broke into the courtyard. Rotor wash blasted grit into their faces, the thump of an MH-60 Blackhawk filling the air. The call sign Archangel cut sharp across comms, ready for pickup. The side door hung open, crew chief waving them in. Tracer fire arced upward from the far fence, green streaks clawing through the dark. Dalton fired a long burst to keep heads down while Quinn shoved Milenov into the cabin. Beck was last to board, turning for one final sweep. His rifle barked 3 times, each shot measured, buying the seconds they needed. Shaw yanked him inside as the helicopter lifted, the ground dropping away. The bird banked hard east, engines roaring, rounds snapping harmlessly in the rotor wash. Inside the cabin, no one spoke. The name Lyle still hung heavy in the air, louder than the gunfire fading behind them. It was not just an escape. It was the revelation of a war that had only begun. The steel towers of Pittsburgh's Strip District glowed against the night, built over what had once been smoke and furnace. Beck led the way through a service entrance, Shaw close behind, the rest of the team watching the alleys. In his hand was a faded set of notes left by Aaron Beck decades earlier. They marked a structural column in the basement of the old mill, a place where concrete had been poured thick. The air smelled of rust and damp as they descended into the bowels of the building. Quinn knelt by the far wall, running a handheld scanner across the column. The device pulsed faint green, confirming a shift in density. Beck steadied his breath and began to drill, the tool grinding quietly into stone. Dust curled upward in thin streams. At 3 centimeters deep, a probe camera slipped inside and caught the gleam of corroded steel. Together, they pulled free a small military issue case, sealed tight despite the decades. Beck wiped the surface with his sleeve, his throat tightening at the sight of his father's handwriting etched faint along the edge. They carried the case to a safe flat nearby, shutting blinds and blacking out windows before Quinn pried the seal. Inside lay microfilm, still intact, the images sharp when projected against a white wall. Names, nodes, transfers, all stamped with the words, Project Meridian. A roster appeared, listing Rusk, but marking him only as coordination. Beside him was Colonel Everett Lyle, later promoted to general, the role annotated as director. Beck's jaw set hard, but beneath the weight of betrayal came vindication. His father had been right all along. Within hours, they were on the move again. Cover identities as defense analysts, allowing them to enter a secure briefing room at the Naval War College. Inspector General Alan Whitaker met them there, his posture sharp, his eyes quick. Beck handed him the drive, bypassing naval intelligence entirely. Whitaker reviewed the files in silence, his face tightening with each frame. When he finally spoke, his voice was iron. Directive 9. This goes straight to the Senate. No delays. The moment carried more force than gunfire. Decades of lies had cracked, and the truth was finally breaking through. Rows of white headstones stretched in perfect symmetry under the spring sun, their alignment as exact as ranks on parade. The air at Arlington carried a silence that felt heavier than any battlefield, broken only by the soft wind stirring the grass. At the center of the gathering, a flag-draped casket rested on a stand. The name Aaron Beck finally etched in official record as honor rather than disgrace. The man who had been branded a failure was about to be remembered for the sacrifice he had truly made. The honor guard moved with precision, their steps measured, boots striking earth in unison. Each motion was rehearsed until flawless. Yet in that moment, it felt sacred. Rifles glinted in the sun as the detail took position. A bugler raised his horn, and the first notes of taps floated across the air, thin and haunting. Heads bowed all at once. The melody carried sorrow and pride together, stretching out until it seemed even the sky stood still. Nolan Beck stood at attention, his dress uniform sharp, hands clenched behind his back. His chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, but his eyes betrayed the weight pressing inside. Beside him stood Chief Quinn, her expression fixed, her gaze locked forward a few paces behind. The men of Sentinel Accord stood in civilian jackets, no medals, no recognition, yet their presence spoke louder than words. They bore witness to the truth that had taken 3 decades to surface. As the last note faded, the honor guard folded the flag, each crease deliberate, each corner pressed with reverence. When the final triangle was formed, stiff and perfect, it was placed into Nolan's hands. He accepted it with a motionless stance, his throat tight as the weight of cloth and memory settled into his grip. It was not just fabric. It was vindication. It was his father's honor restored. The silence deepened until it felt like the ground itself held its breath. From the shade of a sycamore at the cemetery's edge, a figure stood alone, shoulders square, suit dark, posture unmistakable. Nolan's breath caught as he turned, the world narrowing to that single silhouette. Colton Shaw was alive. His face bore lines of exhaustion, bruises that had not fully faded, but his stance carried the same strength as before. For a heartbeat, Nolan could not move. Then he stepped away from the crowd, boots crunching over gravel until he stood face to face with the man thought lost. Shaw's voice came low, quiet enough that only Nolan could hear. The name may change. The mission doesn't. Nolan's jaw tightened. His reply carried as a whisper. The mission continues. Together. They turned back toward the casket. The folded flag clutched tight. No one else spoke to Shaw, yet eyes followed him, whispers stirring through the rows. Legends needed no announcement. Presence alone was enough. The rifle team fired 3 volleys, the shells clinking against stone. The folded flag rested against Nolan's chest as the ceremony closed. He thought of the years spent under shadow, of the father whose honor was buried and then restored. Tears burned but did not fall. The nation saluted in silence, and for the first time in decades, Aaron Beck was remembered as he should have been. Pride and grief mingled in the air, binding the living to the dead, and in that moment the mission of truth felt eternal. The crowd at Arlington slowly thinned, the sound of boots on gravel fading into the stillness. Nolan Beck stood alone for a moment longer, the folded flag pressed tight against his chest. The weight was more than cloth. It was years of silence, of suspicion, of carrying his father's name through whispers and shadows. Now it was vindication. His father had been cleared, honored, remembered. That truth would not be buried again. Quinn stood nearby, her posture sharp, her eyes steady. The men of Sentinel Accord lingered at a distance, their presence quiet, but certain. They did not need words. Their bond was written in scars, in operations that would never be recorded, in the knowledge that some battles were fought with no witnesses. Nolan looked at them and saw the strength of loyalty that survived outside any uniform. In their silence he found reassurance. His thoughts turned back to the name revealed inside that sterile facility. General Everett Lyle, the Director of National Intelligence, the man who had pulled strings in the dark. The Meridian network was not gone. 2 nodes still glowed on the map Pierce had shown him, reminders that the fight would continue. The mission had shifted, but it had not ended. He knew the days ahead would demand more than he had already given. Yet for the first time, he felt steady under that weight. The last note of taps lingered in his memory, thin and haunting, fading into the spring air. He thought of his father's voice, of words passed down in fragments, of a mission carried forward through blood and time. Truth may be buried, but it always finds the light. Nolan whispered the words that had become a vow. The mission of truth never ends. He turned from the rows of white stones, the folded flag pressed firm against his heart, and stepped into the future with resolve as steady as the silence that honored the past.